All right, thanks everybody. As Lucy mentioned, we're going to have a little conversation here, but I do want to, very quickly open up the conversation to all of us, because I think not only on the topic of bias, but on the subjects that we've been discussing all day, I think it's important for us to have a chance to interact. I'm excited to have this conversation on bias. This is something that I think is an important topic for us to consider, and I think it's important to consider from a couple perspectives. And I like the conversation around bias in particular because it's this place that I think really helps illuminate people's perspectives on data. I've often seen people say, well, all of this big data stuff is biased, so I'm not going to use it, as a way to kind of dismiss entire methodologies and techniques. And then I've also seen, on the other side, data scientists who I frequently work with not spend as much time considering bias as they maybe should. And what I'm hoping in this conversation is we get out of a black and white view of bias, but begin to think about the role that bias plays in data and how we can consider it. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rebeca. I actually met Rebeca through my work at Beyond Uptake. We run a data fellowship program. Rebeca is one of our 8 first fellows. Do you want to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work with UNHCR?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure and also a very engaging conversation in the morning. My name is Rebeca Moreno Jimenez, originally from Mexico, living in Geneva now, working for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I am part of a very special team of rebels, I would say, which is the UNHCR Innovation Team. We are kind of like a mini startup within the UN agency, which is approximately 10,000 people, majority of them located in the field in one of the most hardship tourist stations in the world. And we are a team of 14, basically seeing on issues and challenging the organization itself to take a more innovative approach. And in that sense, on the 14, we have different specializations. My specialization is data science, kind of like the first data scientist in the whole UNHCR, though we have data analysts and statisticians, but just to bring that methodology perspective into the organization. So I'm very, very delighted to be here, and I hope I can share a bit of the work and how we consider bias in the work that we do with forcibly displaced people and refugees.
So over lunch, these considering bias worksheets, I believe, were passed out on the chairs here. And what you can see at the bottom is 3 kind of types of bias that we're going to cover in our conversation. The first being statistical bias, the second being analytical bias, and the third being human bias. Another way to think about it is data bias, algorithm bias, and algorithm maker bias. And that's kind of going to frame our conversation. So as we think about biased data, this is a phrase that I hear often. People saying, well, that's a biased data set, or that's biased data, so we're unable to use it. One of the things that I want to pull back a little bit on is this idea that really data in and of itself is not biased. Right? Data in and of itself is not biased. It just is not always representative of certain populations. To give an example, in Chicago, the data science team for the city at one point used Twitter data to try and find food code violations, like health code violations. And what they found is that all these health code violations were being picked up in all these hipster, upper middle class neighborhoods, because that's where the majority of Twitter users were. So it's Twitter data is not representative of the entire population, but that doesn't mean that it's inherently biased. There is a very important relationship between the data and how it's being used, right? Another way I like to think about this is in Chicago, we have this great river running through our downtown. It's this beautiful resource, right? And data is a resource that we can use. But its uses are sometimes limited because the resource is sometimes limited. And what I mean by that is, the Chicago River works great for transporting goods or for people boating on, but it's so dirty you should never go swimming in it. It's absolutely disgusting. But it doesn't mean that the resource isn't ever useful. It has limited use. And so we need to think about the data that we have as being what are the uses and use cases that we can utilize it for. So Rebecca, as you think about representativeness, right? Because I think this is really the heart of the statistical bias issue, is the data that we're sometimes using truly representative of the questions that we're asking. In your work with UNHCR, you work with very vulnerable populations, sometimes disconnected populations. How do you think of representativeness in the data that you're working with?
We usually think it from the two perspectives. We think it from the forcibly displaced people perspective. We call them in our jargon POCs, or persons of concern. And we think it also in the host community, or the public in this case, right? So the persons that are receiving them, the people that are affected by them, we call them the affected communities. Actually, both are affected, one because they are displaced by conflict, but the other ones is because they are the host. And so they have their own issues. And in that sense, we work together into peaceful coexistence. And that's the whole goal at the end for integration as one of the durable solutions for the agency. In the sense of representative for persons of concern, when we are the ones that are conducting registration, which is the full process where a person of concern is, with their informed consent, ask for their personal data to be able to have an identity for the agency, and at the end assist them with the help that they need, not only legal, but also like assistance in terms of food, or psychosocial services in some cases. In that case, we do have 100% of representative, because we do have the data sets, and they're protected by our data privacy policy stuff. But in some cases, when the government of the country that is receiving the refugees takes the mandate of registering, as the majority of the governments are responsible for, and we don't have that access to that data, we are kind of like doing proxies sometimes and trying to triangulate us, like how many people did we serve food today, because the government does not allow us to register the people because it has to do with national security and or collecting some of the things. So you're working along with partnerships to try to figure out how many people, how representative that data is. And so that's one side of the coin. I guess the other side of the coin is working with the host communities. And we have this example about, we have a project actually that generated last year about the perception of host communities towards refugees. And originally it was a question about how the people are actually being smuggled. We know that this is the practice. We know that this is the practice in many countries. And we wanted to kind of validate it with social media. And what we found out is more the perception and the opinion of some host communities on people coming into the countries, and some of them is like they're invader, like they're taking our jobs, etc. So what we did and acknowledge is, because this is what social media, we acknowledge that as a bias, right? So how representative is social media in terms of age of people that are connected, even from their own host communities. I guess that maybe someone that is from another generation, that's not the millennial generation, or young people that are tweeting, are having maybe different opinion of these people that are tweeting. These people are very vocal. Some of them were supporting refugees, and some of them were actually condemning them. So we cannot assume that that's the voice of the host community, especially in Europe, that we were actually research about, that it's representative, so it's not, it depends on.
This is, I think you raise an interesting point here, which is, some of this is, I think, the perspective of a data scientist versus a statistician versus an ethnographer or something of that kind of training, is, I think as data scientists, we're sometimes willing to say, this is imperfect, but it maybe is directionally correct, right? So, Twitter is not necessarily representative, or social media is not necessarily representative of the entire population, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn something from it. So how are you in your work, because you're very much in an organization full of very well-trained statisticians and ethnographers and sociologists, and you're trying to bring in, I think, a different perspective. How is that integrating within UNHCR's work? And how do you talk about the limits of analysis, where you say, all right, don't infer X, Y, and Z from this data, but you can use it for such and such purpose?
Right, so in this case, with what it turned to be a joint collaboration with United Nations Global Pulse, which is one of the big data capacity building agencies at the UN, we encounter that. So in the sense of xenophobic comments, or racist comments, or discriminatory comments, And in an agency, not only statisticians, in an agency full of lawyers, I would say, for the ones with the lawyers in the room, protection team, which is the main team in the UNHCR and the main mandate, majority of lawyers. So trying to influence their decisions to see what it's supposed to be, maybe a new policy, a new regulation, or a new convention at some point. If that happens, that's a difficult part. And trying to find evidence for that, it's even more difficult. So what we did with UN Global Pulse is to produce this white paper, describing what we found only in Twitter, and to basically ask them in the paper, can you raise this question of, we have communities that are portraying xenophobia towards refugees, and we're finding in the data, it's not representative, a lot of these cities, but whenever there was a terrorist attack, we set up the monitor, like sentiment monitor, and spike, like it was Nice, it was Saint Etienne, it was Munich, it was Berlin and Munich were the ones that was like a bit consistent on the same language and stuff, but when when Berlin happened, which was after all of them, and we were tracking them in time in last year, it was the most spiteful in the sense of discrimination and xenophobia, and how it was linked directly, which couldn't, and maybe London now, with refugee population. And so in our case, we were portraying, and we put the white paper, and hopefully the lawyers take care of it, saying we're addressing a policy issue. UNHCR should have a policy against discrimination and xenophobia, which we don't have. We have a lot of high-level statements with many various discourses that they give in the speech, but we don't. And so hopefully from the data science perspective, we can bring a bigger issue that can help the organization to have policy, and at the same time help governments and maybe organize campaigns with the population. So that's
one of the other things, we were talking about this over the lunch break with this particular white paper with UN Global Pulse, was that you employed the use of third-party software to do the sentiment analysis itself on Twitter. Can you talk some about that process and how, particularly transparency, questions have arisen because of the use of a third-party proprietary piece of software?
Of course. That is a huge issue for bias. As long as I think we, at the joint meetings that we have with Pulse, is like, we don't have the tools, nor sometimes the technical capacity, just me building models in the whole UNHCR. So the technical capacity to do this is very limited. So I said, I need this quickly because Berlin just happened, and we need to do this in retrospective, and we need to do it in the future as well. So the Pulse recommended us to use the software proprietary. And when I was asking questions, how is this built? Like, how can I tell the software that according to my research bias, which is super biased on humanitarian grounds, these fuck refugees, or I'm sorry because of my friend, is a racist comment according to our standards, right? And doing some of the comments that we're doing, associating refugees like they're terrorists, for us as a racist, maybe for the general public might not be racist. And so to influence the machine in that sense, we needed to come with assurance of disclosure, of being more open and transparent than the rest of the people that are actually working on xenophobia issues and doing some ethnography research on xenophobia, et cetera. So first was to disclose the assumptions that we were making. So the assumptions that not all people in Europe are racist or xenophobic towards refugees, but we did believe that there were some populations, and then disclose the training sets, or at least the tweets that we were, when the machine produces the tweets that were the sampling, we said these are the killings that we consider as biased or xenophobic according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights definition of xenophobia. And so, which is vilifying a population, making them, like target of discrimination, etc. And so we put that in a document just to put, these are the examples that we tell the machine. And then we also disclose the code that we use, or the taxonomy that we use. So certain words that were used, that represented maybe Islamophobia, etc. So to put that in the 4 different languages that we trained the machine, which was French, German, Greek, because we have another data set in English. So all that process just to come up with a certain number that was like 50% of these sample of tweets that represent this specific age population with this specific socioeconomic background are racist and stuff. It just, yeah.
I think the whole role of transparency is very vital as we talk about especially algorithmic bias. We're seeing this conversation certainly take place in the United States right now around criminal justice in particular, as more and more criminal justice systems start utilizing proprietary software from vendors to estimate, the likelihood of someone reoffending, for example. If an algorithm is making a decision about human lives that can't be validated by a third party or can't be explored by a third party for a variety of biases, I think it raises real questions about all these institutions and the roles that they're playing in our lives. So I think this idea of how do we wrestle with transparency, how do we find ways of not just making data open, but algorithms open. And we're beginning to see this more and more in public institutions that are saying it's not enough just to open up publicly available data, but can we open up the algorithms that are now providing more and more, directing more and more of our services. So I think that this kind of whole question of transparency is really vital.
Right. In the case, I guess, when you're on the humanitarian sector, we're dealing with saving lives, right? People that are in a well-founded fear of persecution in some cases, or a very obvious, evident reason that they're gonna die if they come back to the country of origin because of the war that is happening in the countries. And in our case, in another project that we're trying to do some apply predictive analytics, specifically from Somalia into Ethiopia, the team of Ethiopia is asking us how many people are they gonna come, and how many, and when, and where, and how can we help them if they come? And we're trying to build a model, and this is still a question, and the question arise, and I told everyone in Ethiopia, it's gonna be a machine, and it's gonna be imperfect, and it's gonna be most probably wrong, and you need to know that. But in the sake of saving lives, and for the sake of saving someone, you need to take it as is. But if it was the other way around, if maybe it was the prevention of being killed someone, that's a very different story, right? And that's something that humanitarian agencies need to take into account, because in this case, it's just to provide humanitarian assistance, but in the case of criminal justice, or trying to say that we at some point were locating smugglers or terrorists from the incoming population, which we're not doing, but I think it could be potentially done, right? Like, because of certain behavior, because of maybe residents of conflict, etc. How can we are gonna distinguish? Because in some countries, the borders are very porous. They could just pass. They're nomads in some of the countries. So how can you distinguish who is passing to your border to someone that is not? And if you avoid people passing to your border, and I think that's the question in Europe right now, being raised with migration policy, how are you discriminating or having the guts to discriminate about an algorithm, someone that could potentially be killed or deprived from life or detained or tortured when they go back to their countries because they're actual refugees? I think that's a question maybe that Germany is actually raising with the open door policy, that we need to welcome them, because if I use a machine to discriminate that person from coming or not, if I use biometrics and then a combination of a credit score or whatever, you're actually putting someone's life in danger, and that's something that companies not only, but also organizations that are dealing with these policy issues need to think about.
Yeah, that raises a couple, I think, additional questions. So one is really this idea of data science deals in probabilities, right? Like the best modelers will tell you every model is wrong, right? Every model is wrong. But the question is kind of how wrong and in what direction. And some of the things that data science allows you to do is to actually play with variables. This is the decisions that modelers can make, which is why human bias begins to play a role in this, of saying, all right, how many false positives am I willing to get? How many false negatives? What's the trade-off between the two? In this kind of case of porous borders we were talking over lunch, one could imagine, do I want to catch, every criminal or every smuggler? We're doing some work in human trafficking. Do we want to catch every trafficker? But then also, potentially reject legitimate people coming across the border? Or do I want to allow every legitimate refugee through? And do I want to then, potentially put at risk that society? And that kind of trade-off is something that data scientists are oftentimes thinking through. And then the second one is this idea of the consequences of models. I think for those of us that are working in the social sector, I'd be curious, like at UNHCR, what is the conversation like around kind of the consequences of modeling? As we start to encode some of these decisions into machines, there is something, it raises different kind of moral questions around the consequences of those decisions. So how are you guys wrestling with some of those within the organization?
I think, I don't know, this kind of reminded me of the book, O'Neill book of Weapons of Math Destruction. If you have read it, yes, it's a great book. And I think we encounter that every day in the organization. Some of the decisions that the organization could be potentially making with a model, which is not the case right now, it's only statistics, could have serious impact not only on partners' activities, meaning operational partners like UNICEF, WFP, all of the other local NGOs that are helping us on the ground to assist and protect those people, but also having specifics on business, maybe even private sector partnerships, like for vendors, for example, like if you're going to supply shelter, if you're going to supply food, water, and then you're going to optimize those things with a model. How valid is the model, or how can you do it? And so our response so far, specifically with the Somalia case, was to triangulate first data. Not all the data, like you were saying, data is not wrong by itself, but sometimes when we put the thing into the model, we produce a result, then a lot of the senior management, because in the case of humanitarian sector, that decision needs to be taken very, very fast, specifically on emergencies. Like there's 3,000 people coming in right now into the border. I need to know if I need to do this or this. Otherwise, people can be dying. Otherwise, people are not attending when they need medical assistance. So the urgency of our sector is very special compared to other development, or I guess more human rights approach, or peace building, which is they're working with long protected issues. And in our case, the fast brain is the needs that needs to be activated, and for that, they think that maybe the Holy Grail is a model because it's going to respond to you very quickly. And so we need to, our responsibility, I guess, as data scientists and also innovation team, to tell the senior management what I'm telling you is not the truth. It's the only partial solution that you're asking me on the amount of time that you give me to respond, which is few minutes in some cases. So that's something that we're wrestling with still. I think there's a lot of need for capacity building, even for senior management, to understand the potential and the threats of data scientists.
And that's, I think we've been talking as a theme throughout today is some of the human capital investments that need to be made to, not only build models, but we've been talking about data literacy. Like that term has come up several times today, and I think the concept of data literacy is very important, to be able to know how to interpret some of the recommendations. Just because a model spits something out doesn't mean that it's truth. Right. How do you want to interpret that? How do you want to engage with that data? I want to talk now for a minute, we've talked some about like bias of underlying data, the bias of some of the algorithms, and the need for transparency and combating that bias. Now, I want to talk about the human level, right? I work in an environment that's a traditional tech company, fast-growing, U.S.-based. I work with lots of data scientists on both commercial projects and social good projects. Sometimes, they don't have the breadth of lived experience that the people represented in the data have. Sometimes there is a disconnect between the person creating the model and even the consequences, going back to that conversation. It's one thing for a person, like me, to be wrestling with issues of, costs and benefits, and another to have a person that actually is represented in that data who's going to live that cost or that benefit in that conversation. So how do you help the people within the organization? How do you help yourself, gain a level of insight and experience that hopefully counteracts some of your inherent bias in the way that you approach your modeling in particular? Because it's very easy to build a model that confirms my bias, and I just assume, well, that must be a correct model, rather than pressure testing it a little bit further.
Right. I'm going to tell you a story then. So this is like on the sense of Ethiopia. Ethiopia came to us, Ethiopia operation. This is Doloado, the border with, is the Somali region of Ethiopia, is the border with Somalia. And they experienced a high influx of refugees back in 2011. It was because of the drought that happened in the Horn of Africa. That exacerbated, of course, what has been going on for years in Somalia. It's no secret that Somalia is one of the most frail countries in the world. I mean, they have pirates. And not only because of that, it's Al-Shabaab, the non-state groups, actors that are working there, the issues with governance and security, etc., etc. So by default, Somali refugees are prima facie, meaning there's no questions, are going to suffer if they go back to their countries. So at some point when the drought hit in 2011, there was a wave of refugees, 100,000 refugees crossed the border in the year 2011 of a team, most probably in that back then, composed by 50 people in the border. So you can imagine they were overreading the capacity of the partners, etc. So when they had a peak in January of 3,000 people, again, 3 consecutive rain seasons failed in Somalia. They were terrified that they were the scenario was happening again. And so that's when they called us, because they went to a statistical team and then they went to another team. And then at the end, it ended up the problem with the innovation team. Can you help us see how many people are coming? And I was starting to, first they asked the questions like, how do you know they're coming? It's like, oh, because they're saying the same things in 2011. The goats and the cows die. There's no rain. There's no crops. Al-Shabaab is still, taxing them. They're killing them on the basis of ethnicity, etc. And so I have a lot of variables to look into consideration. So I needed first to ask for help. World Meteorological Organization to provide some data sets on weather patterns, FAO to provide some data sets on food and agricultural issues that are happening in Somalia. Then OCHA actually OCHA came a later. I'm going to tell you how. We were me as I guess data scientists in UNHCR trying to put big data, satellite UNOSAT with satellite data on some of the roads that were blocked by Al-Shabaab, etc. And I was using my data science cap and trying to start the model, or at least the cleaning of the humongous data set that they sent us. And UNHCR, of course, we have the data of the population that were coming in by age, date, gender, and everything else. So trying to anonymize, put it together, etc. At some point during April, there was a team that was going to Ethiopia from Geneva just to do some research on energy. And the more data that I got as a data scientist, the more I was doing the thing to try to build the data for the model, the more I realized that I was not feeling it. And especially the innovation team is very prone to human-centered design. Everything that we do is based on human beings. We work for and with refugees. We build things with and for refugees. So I told my boss, can I go with the energy team? And they were like, why? They're doing now another research on energy issues and stuff. I'm just going to jump into that wagon and try to validate some of this data. And then he trusted me and said, okay, go ahead. And I went there, and I started to research a lot and talk to the community. Why are you here? Where do you come from? What are you coming? And the stories like, I lost my cows, I lost my goats, I cannot grab anything, my family is back there, they're menaced by Al-Shabaab, etc. And then one refugee told me, but you guys, the blue ones, because they call us blue, they don't distinguish UN agencies. The blue ones are the ones actually keeping my family, helping them there. I was like, what do you mean? Well, we're not coming because they're getting help from you guys. And so when the help is gone, because at some point it might be gone or not, is it going to be gone? They want to know if we're going to continue funding humanitarian assistance. And I was like, if you help us, I can stay with my cows and in my land, which is ancestral. But if you don't help us, I'm no one. I am that. And so I didn't factor UN into my model. So I took my data science cap and put my I'm a social scientist by background. And I put my social scientist, and I came back to Geneva and I was like, we have the wrong assumption. The number one thing in our model is not the weather, it's not Al-Shabaab, it's ourselves. We are the ones helping them, and if we're help, so just to tell you that the whole model changed. And we needed to request OSHA, the assistance of every single person that was given assistance in all the areas of Somalia, and when they were expecting them to have cuts. And so this is when OCHA was like, we're receiving cuts from the US government, we're receiving cuts from Lala, this is gonna be urgent at some point, you're gonna have people then moving. So it's just a bit of a story on how we modify models based on the human interaction.
And I think that's really important. The organizations that I see doing the best kind of data science work in this sector are the ones that do get out in the field, right? there is a very human aspect to this kind of work that I think sometimes people don't recognize and don't see the importance of actually getting out in the field and talking to people and all of that. They assume that if it's data, like it's fully baked, right? All you need is the data in your computer, and you can answer any question. And that's not at all how data science works. I want to open up for questions in just a minute, but something you said at the beginning I wanted to circle back to, which is this idea of, again, going back to representativeness. One of the changes that we're seeing as a result of digital society and the digital expansion is the fact that we can sometimes have almost a full view of the population. Right? Statistics was really grounded in this theory and idea that there's no way we can ever know everything about everyone, so we need to sample. And so we developed a lot of complex methodologies for how to do that in a representative way, where I could talk to 500 people and infer something about a 5 million person population. As we're starting to, as Lucy was talking about earlier, provide services and capture data at the point of service provision, as we're as the ease of data collection continues to grow, and we start to actually have this, is things like what's going on in Estonia with digital citizenship and all sorts of stuff are occurring. We can actually get a much fuller picture of the population. So in your work, you guys are both a policy institution to some extent, and then also a service provision. On the service provider side, how do you think about the data that you're tracking? How do you ensure that people are engaged in that system, that you're actually getting the data that you think you are?
So there's challenges and opportunities, right? One of or many of the challenges is for us is that sometimes we don't have access to that population, either because they're in a war zone or because of some geographical constraints or any other issues with access. So the thing on that sense, data is not truly representative because we don't know what we don't know, right? That's a typical data scientist thing, but it's true in the world of the humanitarian affairs, because some of it, especially the internally displaced people, these are nationals of their own country. The information is in the ownership of the government. And so when that information is not shared with us, we don't have it. And so how can we serve and how can we provide shelter, services, psychosocial support, things that are related with food, like with WFP, et cetera. If WFP comes to us as like, give me all the list of the population because we're supposed to register or not, and we can say we don't know, that's the Ugandan government has that data. This is the case right now in Uganda. We don't have it. We could do a proxy of according the we needed, the innovation team actually was the one pushing cell phone towers into the camp in Biribiri, because we assume, or we could, that was an assumption as well, that maybe we could track some of the CR, like the call records data. Assumption because then the regulation comes in with in a country like Uganda, et cetera, but at least to know many, like the cell phone or the telco could tell us more or less there's some sort of 200,000 subscribers or something like that we could more or less triangulate, like how many food did you serve today, how many psychosocial people you serve today, triangulation of data when you don't have, and that's the first issue in the issues of access. And I guess the other thing that the opportunity that we haven't fully tapped, but we're exploring the innovation unit, the 14 people that we are, is how to work with other, not only partners, but also with the private sector. And I think UNHCR as a policy agency, UN agency, is more and more trying to engage and trying to find out the ways, because the private sector at the end is the ones that are developing the technology, doing the R&D work, and we are not innovation at the sense of research and development. We're innovation because in the humanitarian sector, some of the things that we are trying to apply had never been applied before. But in the world, like mobile data collection is 20 years old technology. We are just right now applying like strategy, mobile data collection at the global level. It has 1 or 2 years. So how far behind we are, and not because we want to, it's also because of the constraints in the field. There's no connectivity. What are you talking about? Having mobile data collection, there's no food, there's no water, there's no light. And I've been there because I've been into the camps. And so trying to put that cell phone tower even just to work with a private sector company and to tell them, look, there could be potential for business opportunity here. Maybe it's not going to be the huge multi-million business, but they're going to buy you 1 or 2 SIM cards to communicate with their family back in South Sudan, and they can see maybe as a philanthropy, maybe as a business partner, like to say, oh yeah, and by the way, we're collecting data. Do you need us? Like, definitely.
That's really important. I've been doing some work with Slum Dwellers International, which works in informal settlements around the world. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about is the need, like almost the right to be represented in a digital way, so that if all of these other systems are starting to use digital data to make decisions, if you're not represented digitally, it's almost as if you don't exist to some of these systems. So I'd love to open up to whatever questions you have for Rebecca or myself on the question of bias, how you see it play out in your organizations, or how you're addressing it. Jessica? Yeah.
I think here's both think about how bias relates to scale. So I heard a story last week about an entrepreneur who started very successful, sold it, got huge, but he had such a bad experience organizationally, so he never started another company with more than 350 people. Caps it there, he started like 10 other companies, caps them all to 50. And it was a functional organization. So for him, that was a healthy organization, so we could work together. Is there a way with the size of data set has to be either small enough so you can see the bias in it, or big enough so that it is represent? Like, is there a way that you can put some parameters around that to either make bias more likely, more visible, or more unlikely?
It's a really interesting question. So again, like I think oftentimes the size of the data is the least interesting thing about it, and it doesn't always tell you anything about the bias, right? Like I could create a data set called Andrew's height, and it would have one metric in it, and I could either lie or tell the truth. And you would just need to you need to validate it. I think it's really about understanding like how is something collected, why was something collected, who was collecting it. Like thinking like some of it's I think just thinking through those kind of very simple questions about no matter what size data you have, we can sometimes be pretty clear about are there places within this data set that's probably veering off course. But we also need to ask ourselves, what's the consequence of that? One of the things that I think a lot about is that just because data is imperfect doesn't mean it's not useful. So even with data that is imperfect or biased, we can sometimes get directionally correct information. We can sometimes still extract some use from it. But for me, when I try to understand the bias of a data set, I try to understand why was it collected. I mean, some of the questions that are on here, right? Like why was it collected? Who was collecting it? Would there be an incentive to lie? Would there, how is this data validated? If it's, coming from an individual, is there any way to validate some of it? So I think it's less about the size and more about like the provenance, like where is it coming from?
No, I totally agree. I think in the case of what we're experiencing with the climate data is huge. And so the more data that we have, the more nuances we get in a specific region. So the case of Somalis are nomads by livelihood. And so if I would make an inference of like in this place it didn't rain, but I know that they're moving, so it doesn't matter if I have the whole rainfall of the region, I need to know nuances, even on centimeters of grace. Where is the grace being grown? Because this is where they are going to be pulled towards. Like, and in that sense, we need that big data. Like we need to know it in order to be able to know if the grace is not growing and that the river is not full in that specific part. Maybe people, that's the inference. Maybe people are going to move towards assistance, towards and stuff. This is an assumption, of course, but in that sense. But in some cases, only one single data point, which was, I guess, my interview when I hit the ground into Ethiopia. One interview with one refugee told me, you are the one making it for us to move. And that was one single data point, which was a qualitative, non-data sense, just a one-on-one interview with a refugee. And that changes the whole model. But I think it's on the data scientist. I mean, if I'm able to have that mindset of switching the research question, switching the why am I collecting this, etc., on a single data point or a huge data set of climate, it's more on the researcher than on the data.
And this is, I think, a really hard thing about data science, is that it can be difficult to know if a model was made badly or well for somebody who didn't make the model. or for who doesn't have that level of data literacy. And so to know if somebody is handling issues of bias correctly or not requires like some level of data literacy, which is why I think in this sector we can sometimes be very skeptical of the role of data in our work because we don't understand it. We're not sure confident we have the human capital necessary to do it well. And so that's, I think, a very valid point. I think we had another question over here.
Very quick one as a follow-up on de-biasing technique. You mentioned what you've learned as well. To what extent you can institutionalize this learning in a university way? What did you learn there that your colleagues are not able to do?
Correct. So another part of it, we document every single thing, or maybe I'm document obsessed. And that's maybe the social sciences part, data scientists as well. So what we've been doing besides the white paper is, a white paper with different with any academic research paper is you document the process. How did you come about the research question, which is never ours, is usually on demand. An operation is the one posing us the challenge. We are not like curious, not that we're not curious, but we're not curious in the sense that we're imposing them our research questions. We're trying to solve an issue that they have to help refugees on the ground. So that's the first one. And then document the process and the assumptions and everything, and then sharing it with the teams, especially the data analyst teams. It's like, in case you encounter this, this is how we solve it. And also, to be fair with the statisticians and the data analyst teams, we do have some operational guidelines and some manuals on how to conduct assessments that are based on statistics, which, I mean, it's valid because also in statistics you have p-values and you have your null hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. So that also helps them with their own mindset, which is a statistical mindset, to conduct their own research. For me also, I think the most important thing is to combine it with social sciences, which I think our organization, because of the majority are from the humanities sector and stuff, they do get it, and they are very well versed in qualitative methods, in needs assessment, participatory assessment, but it's about also documenting that and portraying it, maybe visualizing it. That will be something that is, I think, a good organizational practice, especially for the senior management team. What I've seen is, if I go with my white paper, they're like, right, the taxonomy, right? But if I go with a data visualization, it's like, this is what we find in one page. They're like, oh, where did this come from? And then they're interested into the whole documentation part that we did. But it's just a matter of how to communicate that into the organization. Good data visualization.
Absolutely. Yeah, question over here.
Or bots. Of course. I mean, the issue with the bots, right? Trying to see which ones are the issue with the fake news is the same, right? Where like Facebook is in the middle of that conversation. It was like, how are you fostering or not people that are liking like the algorithm, and then you posting more and more fake news? What we did in the training data set that we have, we click one by one. It takes a lot of time to see the other posts, to see if that person was actually posting opinion, or so you can detect the bots really quickly, especially the marketing ones. And like, in order to, before categorizing as a racist or non-racist or blame refugees or not, we click and we went into the, not only we trust the machine to do it, because the machine has their own proprietary software and algorithm, we utilize humans to read that one. We find something very funny actually on that one, especially in the German ones. The German population tends to be very sarcastic to the extent that the machine was cataloging certain a posts like the following. It was like, thank you, Merkel, for Berlin, hashtag welcome refugees. And if the machine reads it as is, that's a positive post. And so the machine is a thank you. The machine could associate that as a positive sentiment, you know.
All the words are positive.
Welcome refugees is the hashtag that we actually use sometimes as well in our own campaigns. And then when you see the actual post or the retweet and stuff, so you need to go and see that. So that requires that research I'm talking. So 1 year research project, because we went one by one to see before categorizing and making the assumption. Though we must probably skip some of them and we put it in the paper. On the hours that we utilize, blah, 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 we must probably skip some votes. And also to have the native speakers. And in our case, our team has the fortune as any UN agency to have the native speakers there. So when I say, like, I understand more or less German, not that much, and I went with my German colleague from Berlin. Is this a positive line? No, that's sarcasm. They're trying to make mock of the open door policy. And also, how do you know? It's like, read the other tweets. And so we went and read and catalog.
It raises the question, I mean, just getting the data itself is not always very useful for this kind of project, because you need to create a labeled training data set. But there are ways of actually like eliminating bots through some of this probabilistic stuff and things like that, trying to identify accounts. But again, with a lot of this kind of analysis, you're not trying to necessarily say, like, we don't necessarily need the individual that we're trying to like intervene on. We want a sentiment of the population, or we want something in general, like a directional trend. And that's, you can make some assumptions of saying, like, this is imperfect, we're probably labeling some of this sarcasm as positive and things like that. So it's like, it's more, I think it comes in around saying, like, how do I interpret the findings as much as anything else, knowing the limitations of the methodology.
And we told at the end, the policy team, is Europe Bureau the one that is behind a lot of the work that we have done. It's like, if we find that 50% of the posts, which is the case for NIS, I think, don't believe the number. Like the number, we might make the mistake. The data is imperfect, our methodology is imperfect, the bias is imperfect, and the proprietary software is imperfect. What we want to tell you is there is a percentage. It could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 15, or maybe 50, that is racist and xenophobic. We don't want to draw attention on the number. We want to draw attention on the issue that people are vilifying, people that like papers that are coming, right? And so at the end, the conclusion of the white paper is not about the number. Like, we don't care about the number. As an agency, we care about the people that are being discriminated and like given those xenophobic comments, right? So at some point, if you're analyzing social media, be worried if you want to, but also if I have a number, which in the case we have, just put the assumptions there. Like, we assume that the bots are not all well trained. We assume that maybe our own language bias. We assume that we're putting human rights super approach, which is our approach. Maybe a normal person would not consider that as racist, and I will totally say that's so xenophobic because I'm humanitarian, of course. So yeah, like just be very transparent about it.
Any other questions?
Informed consent. That's the only thing that I'm going to close this thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. Please join me.